Am I in the right
Yeah,
place?
you're in the right spot.
Okay.
Hello, good morning to all of you. Nice to see you all. We mentioned when we were here 2 weeks ago that oftentimes we get to take our grandchildren up to Redeemer, or is it down to Redeemer Presbyterian Church? And that is the church that Jordan is our son that died 4.5 years ago. He took his family there. And after he died, then we started taking the children to Redeemer also. Family up there. This is still our home church. We haven't gone away. But it's interesting because we usually check on Saturday night. You know, sometimes the kids have sports or the other grandpa and grandma have activities with them. You know, do you want to go to church in the morning? And if they're available, they do. It's usually the 3 boys, and we just started taking little Miss Rosie, who now is also 6. And we just got a text while we were sitting here earlier from Sarah, the mom. The kids are wondering if we're going to go to church today. Isn't that wonderful? The grandkids are asking to go to church, so it is such a privilege to be able to invest in those precious young lives. So if we're not here, then we're at Redeemer. But I just thought I have to share that with you. Then, are we going to go to church today?
So for those of you that don't know who we are, because we've been gone for a long time, I'm Dennis and this is Patty Nun. And we've been here at Berean, I think we were trying to calculate 15, 18 years, somewhere in there. So we really appreciate this class and we miss you when we're not able to be here. Hey, I do want to make an announcement though that I didn't earlier, but there's flyers back on the table back here. I had lunch with a friend of mine, Doug McCallum. If you ever knew the Waffle Man, the original Waffle Man, that was Doug. And Doug and I are good friends. We had a common mentor in our histories. And but there's a program that's going to be held over at St. Mark's on the evening of Sunday, November 10th. And it's to honor all veterans. It's an entire service dedicated to veterans. There's flyers back there. They just want to count for, make sure they've got plenty of seating. But if you are a veteran or you know a veteran that should be made aware of this, please take one of those flyers that I put on the back table. Well, what we want to do today is we're going to talk more about our most recent trip to Turkey. And we fell in love with Turkey about 4.5 years ago, actually. Back when COVID hit and we were looking around for something to watch that was in educational on our televisions, we came across this thing called The Last Apostle. And I shared about this 2 weeks ago. Dr. Mark Fairchild is featured in this 90-minute documentary, and he makes a statement that Patty and I have been to Israel 11 times, and we love Israel. But he makes a statement early on in this to the effect that everything you read in your Gospels took place in what is today modern-day Israel or Jordan, that general area. But virtually everything else in the New Testament takes place in Turkey and Greece and a little bit in Italy. And so we immediately, once we watched it the first time, we watched it several times, we signed up for a trip with him, which was canceled, rescheduled, like a lot of things were during COVID. And then we ended up in 2022 in the spring. We had 3 trips that ended up back to back to back, and we were in the Middle East for 60 days. We went to Egypt, Jordan, Israel, southern Israel for 2 weeks, then to Turkey with Dr. Fairchild, who's become a really, really good friend. And then we came back to northern Israel for 12 days, and then to Greece. But it was all basically church history. I tell people, they say we're church history nerds, and I am just fascinated by the heritage that we have as believers. And so we're going to touch on that today, because our most recent trip, we were actually on a trip to celebrate Patty's birthday and our 51st anniversary. And we were in Italy, and then eventually down to Greece, and then we flew. We thought this would be a good time. We're already over there to go to Cappadocia. So this morning, what we're going to be talking about is Cappadocia and its influence on church history. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. And I need to get back here so I can see a little bit our screen. But if you remember, this is a map showing, and I know it's hard to see from back there, but it's a map showing the travels of Paul. And why does so much of the New Testament feature Turkey and Greece and Italy? Well, because that's where Paul went. And Paul really, in the 30 years that he ministered, it really went from being a sect of the Jews to Christianity being a worldwide religion. And so when we went there, previously, what I talked about 2 weeks ago is the churches in southern and western Turkey. This is where the 7 churches are, but you've got Cappadocia is clear out here. And it does mention in Scripture that Paul planted churches in Cilicia. And Cilicia is an area of the country that has hardly been ever excavated. And the people in Turkey, because they're 99% culturally Muslim, they really don't recognize or spend a lot of time worrying about church history among the Christians. It's interesting, when you go over here to Greece, they consider themselves 95% Christian, mostly Greek Orthodox. And then over here in Turkey, they consider themselves culturally Muslim. One of the things you don't see in Turkey, in our experience, is you don't see a lot of people wearing the garb or reading their Qurans or going to the mosques. But culturally, if you look at their driver's license, they're Muslim. Okay. So, anyway, so we wanted to go to Cappadocia. And what Cappadocia, I'll talk about 3 or 4 things that are really, in terms of church history, are really important. And that is that the Hittite Empire is what you see there in red. This was 1350 BC. And so the Hittites, which are mentioned 35 times in our Bibles, in the Old Testament, you all remember Uriah the Hittite, but the Hittites were the predominant force in that part of the world in 1350. And Genesis 15:18 talks about the fact that God is going to grant the territory of the Hittites to the Jews when he's speaking to Abraham in his covenant. So what happened in this part of the world, and Patty and I have taught church history for years in a number of different churches. And one of the things that was kind of a blur to me, I have to say now in hindsight, is this period of the Byzantine Empire. What is the Byzantine Empire? Well, the Byzantine Empire really started with Constantine. Constantine became a believer. He dedicated his battle for leadership of the Roman Empire to Cairo, to Jesus. His mother Helena was really instrumental in him coming to faith. And that's another story we could spend a lot of time on. But Helena, after he became emperor, Mother Helena went to the Holy Land. Now you got to understand, this is 300 years after Christ. She goes to the Holy Land at 82 years of age, and she identifies the holy sites in Israel. And the thing that's interesting about that is stop and think about an 82-year-old traveling in that day and age, that distance, with an entourage from the emperor, and then identifying these places. And I always tell people, when you go to Israel, if you haven't been there, there's kind of good news and bad news. The good news is we know where most of these places are, or a general location, because of Mother Helena's influence. The bad news is they've built basilicas over the top of them. So it's a little hard to imagine some of these places as they would have been at the time of Jesus. But anyway, what happened was the Emperor Constantine the Great, who created or put out the Edict of Milan. Well, what was the Edict of Milan? The Edict of Milan was the elimination of persecution for Christians in the Roman Empire. They had been persecuted, they'd been martyred, they'd been their properties taken away, their churches and property taken by the government and by others. And he basically says, this is a legitimate group of people. We're not going to persecute them. We're going to give them back their land and their property and so forth. And so the Edict of Milan did not make Christianity the religion of the empire. That came later, but it did legalize Christianity. So what he also did was he moved the capital from Rome to Constantinople. And Constantinople would be the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Now, at the time, they didn't call themselves Byzantines. They called themselves Romans because it was still the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire took this move, and then later through Theodosius was the emperor that actually made Christianity the religion of Rome. But at that time, there were 5 primary churches that were called the patriarchal churches. There was Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, Egypt. And so these 5, when you go back to the time of the councils, these were the time when the theologians were defining our faith. And the reason that the faith today is as it is represented to us by biblical scholars. There were actually 7 different church councils. Actually, you should say there was 8, because the first one was the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem Council is the one that allowed us Gentiles to become Christian believers without practicing the Jewish traditions and faith and diet and everything else. But this is a picture of Constantine, who called the first ecumenical council, which was in Nicaea. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. But Emperor Constantine was very hands-on. He was actually at that event. And the bishops, which I'll be talking about bishops in this presentation, the bishops were the people that were sent by the churches to make these decisions. So here's a list of actually the Roman emperors that ruled from Constantinople. And the Byzantine Empire really lasted from 300 roughly to 1453, when they were defeated by the Turks. But the 2 big events that took place is the Edict of Milan, which was from Constantine, which legalized Christianity. But then the Edict of Thessalonica was issued by Emperor Theodosius, and he's the one that made it the official religion of the Roman Empire. This is an interesting map. It shows you where the Byzantine Empire started and how it shrunk over the years. The year is down here in the left-hand corner, and you can kind of see how it eventually was defeated and broken apart. The Roman Empire fell because of the tribes from the north coming into Italy. But when the Constantinople became the capital of the Byzantine Empire, that's really where everything moved to. So Patty and I spent time in a city called Urga. We spent 5 days in Cappadocia. We flew into Istanbul, and then it's about an 1.5-hour flight out to the center part of the country. And Urga is out right in this area that's known as Cappadocia. And Patty, do you recall what the word Cappadocia means?
I do. It means city of wild horses, wild, healthy horses.
Yep.
Yeah, city of wild, healthy horses.
And but Urga was the city we stayed in. Now, one of the things that you see, there's a couple, 3 different main attractions. Most people that come to Cappadocia probably aren't there for our purposes, for church history. They're there for the sites. Well, the sites are kind of interesting. First of all, they have cave homes everywhere. They have this interesting geography and geology, I should say, that allows a person to carve into these the caves that are there and enlarged them. This is actually the hotel we stayed at, and it is actually 3 cave homes that have been combined into this one hotel that has about 30 rooms.
And actually, we saw like cave apartments. So like we'd have an apartment building, they would have these caves going up this mountain. So fascinating.
So this
Yeah.
is actually our room that we stayed in. And it had another little room off the side. We kind of used it as a dressing room, but it had 2 twin beds in there. There's a bathroom in there. But it's interesting, staying in a cave home. Here we are at a restaurant that's up on like 2nd or 3rd floor, and you can see behind us all the caves. This is right in Urga, right in the city. The other thing you find is fairy chimneys, they call them, but they're formations from volcanoes that are developed, and they say that the reason they end up looking like that is because of erosion. The top stones are more dense and they don't erode as fast as the bottom ones. So these, over the centuries, they develop like this. And again, a lot of these cave homes are put together, and that's still where, and some are deserted and some are fixed up pretty nice. So what's the importance of Cappadocia from our perspective as church history? Well, first of all, it was where the earliest churches grew. Let me read to you from Acts, in Acts 2, 5 through 12. Let me read to you. Anybody remember what happened in Acts 2? Come on, you Bible scholars. Day of Pentecost, okay? I remember as a new believer listening to a lot of 2nd chapter of Acts music.
Yeah.
And now there were Jews, this is verse 5 through 12. And now there were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. And when this sound occurred, the crowd came together and were bewildered because each one of them was hearing them speak in their own language. They were amazed and astonished, saying, Why are not these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we each hear them in our own language to which we were born? Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Pergium and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the districts of Libya around Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretians and Arabs, we hear them in our own tongues speaking of the mighty deeds of God. And they all continued in amazement and great perplexity, saying to one another, What does this mean? I think we underestimate those verses and what happened on the day of Pentecost. In many of those places, people went back and they started preaching the word. They started preaching the gospel. They started telling the story of Jesus resurrected from the dead. The Messiah that was promised has been delivered. These are devout Jews. Imagine a Jew going all the way in that age from Cappadocia to Jerusalem, being there for this event, and then going back and sharing the good news. The Roman church, we see Paul talking about wanting to go to Rome through a lot of his writings. The Roman church was not planted by Paul. The Roman church was planted right here in the 2nd chapter of Acts. And so all these different places, including Egypt, which was a major cultural center for Christianity, and Alexandria for centuries, this is where the Christian church began. In Peter, in verse 1 of Peter, 1 Peter, verse 1, chapter 1, verse 1, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who were chosen. So we see these mention of Cappadocia. So I'm interested in knowing how the church has been there for centuries. So it became a center of Christian learning. How did that happen? Well, we're talking 300 years after the resurrection. There was really a couple of things going on. Number one, there was, before Constantine, persecution of Christians, and people were looking for places to get out of the way. and be able to practice their faith without having to worry about persecution. So Cappadocia was one of those places that they came to. The other thing is that there was this movement of really what I would call a church planting movement, a discipleship movement that you're going to see reflected in some of the stories that I have to share as we go through here. It was really influenced, if you ask most Christians, if they've studied anything about church history, what's important about Cappadocia, they'll say, well, that's where the Cappadocian Fathers came from. And for those of you that don't know who they are, I'm going to give you a little education on that this morning. But the Cappadocian Fathers are really known for two things primarily. Number one, they really refined our theology on the Trinity. And they were instrumental in the early church councils in getting our definition of the Trinity into our theology and into the Nicene Creed. Second thing is that they really had a huge impact on the monastic life. And I'll share with you a couple of different traditions along those lines as we go through here. So they're best known as the Cappadocian Fathers. Christianity is separated from all other world religions by the Trinity. No other world religion. We talk about monotheistic religions, 3 of them, right? They're all centered in Jerusalem. We've got the Jew, the Muslim, and the Christian, but only the Christians have the theology of the Trinity. That's always been the orthodoxy of the Christian church since these early days. And the doctrine of the Trinity were the product of several councils that include 3 men known as the 3 Cappadocians. I know that's hard to read. I got that background a little too dark. Basil of Caesarea lived from 330 to 379. Gregory of Nyssa, and he lived from 330 to 394. Now, those dates have to be off a little bit because these 2 guys are brothers and they're not twins, okay? So we're going to talk more about their family. And then Gregory of Nazianzus was a good friend of Gregory of Nyssa, and these 3 were bishops, and all 3 are saints in the Greek church. But the early bishops of the church, what they did is, again, they refined our theology of the Trinity, and they influenced the development of the Nicene Creed and the other councils. They redefined the monastic life of early churches, and they elevated the status of women in the early churches. And I'll give you a little reasoning behind that as we go through here. But what they did is they changed the monastic life from one that was called hermetistic to symbolist. Well, what that means is early monastic life was considered going off by yourself. Or living in a community where you had your own cell and you basically didn't associate with others. You prayed and you contemplated scripture and God, and you would do it independently. In the early Egyptian era, they would sit on poles or in caves, and literally some people for 20 years, they would spend their life off by themselves. Well, what the Cappadocian Fathers, especially Gregory and Basil, his brother, what they really did was they said, it doesn't make sense for us to go off by ourselves when we could minister to one another, minister to our community, worship together in corporate worship. And so what we think of today as monasteries is more of an outpouring of their efforts to change the idea of monastic life. So here's the 2, Gregory of Nyssa and Basil the Great. This one says that he was born in 330, and Gregory of Nyssa was a younger brother. There was actually, in their family, it's debated between 9 and 10 children. Now, it wouldn't be uncommon for an infant to die, early. But the mother, Amelia, had 10 children. But the thing that's interesting as you study this family and what happened is you start hearing about Macrina. Macrina was their eldest sister. She was the oldest sister. There's a individual that I think we talked about 2 weeks ago called Thecla. Thecla is well known in early Christianity as a woman who was remained a virgin, followed Paul, and she basically gave up wealth and her family to become one of the early Christians. I would call her the first, maybe she's the first nun.
Maybe.
I always tell people that I'm one of the few people you probably ever meet whose wife had to become a nun when she got married. But Mac, her brothers always gave her credit for a lot of their spiritual development and their spiritual interest. And it's interesting, I won't go into it in depth, but they have two younger brothers who were also sainted by the Greek church. And but these two were greatly influenced by their older sister. Their older sister, like Thecla, was actually betrothed to be married, but her husband to be died. And so she said, he's my husband, I'm going to see him in heaven. But she became the bride of Christ. And so she remained single her entire life and cared for her family, her brothers, as well as her mother after her father had died. And I'll show you more about that at the end. But the first place that we went to see, the first place most people go to see in Cappadocia, is what they call the Gorham Open Air Museum. And there's actually 3 different open air museums that we went to. But this one is interesting. This is on the left-hand side, what you see is this was actually a chapel. And it's got, this would have been like a monastery. And there were certain ones of these areas where they would go for initial orientation and training, and then they would go out to these other monasteries. So there's a number of these places. But you see over here on the right, one of the chapels, and you see some of the paintings. Obviously, after hundreds of years, 2,000 years almost, some of these paintings are pretty distorted. On the other, but again, you see this area and you see all kinds of caves, and many of these are chapels. They estimate that probably all in all, there's probably somewhere between 500 and 600 chapels. Now, some of them are very, very small, but some of them are pretty large. But the interior of some of them, I believe this is taken from what they call the dark chapel. And the reason they call it the dark chapel is it had one small window, and because of that, not a lot of light got in. And so you can see these paintings have not been touched up, and these are, almost 2,000 years old. Others are a little more distorted, and some are very, very, brilliant. And not all of those churches had these, because you got to understand, this is there was that period of iconoclasm where the church says, oh, you can't have images of Christ or humans. And so they basically went away from that for a period of time. But just some amazing chapels that we were able to visit. The other thing that you'll learn about if you go to Cappadocia is underground cities. Literally, they have cities that you enter at the ground level, and then they go down. Some of them as much as 11 to 15 stories down below ground. And so we were able to go through one of the most famous ones. This over here shows you kind of an illustration. Here's the entrance at ground level. One of the things that's interesting, I found interesting at least, is there are 3 different places that I've been where I've seen this. And that is the entrance to their home. The entrance to their home up here, the first area is fairly large because they would bring their livestock right in there. Their livestock, they wanted to protect them from the wolves and everything else, but they also wanted to protect those animals. Became kind of I don't know about you, but we have an alarm system at our house. So those goats and sheep and cattle, could be kind of an alarm system if you're somebody else was coming into your home. It's interesting. I've seen this in 2 other places. I've been to Morocco 2 years ago, and in some of those homes, the first room they have is their stable. Same thing's true if you go to the Masai Mara in Africa, in Kenya. The Maasai tribes, the first room of their house is where the cow with her calf is. That way you don't have to go very far to get milk, right? And so, but at any rate, but this is the underground cities, literally hundreds of people. Now, they didn't they didn't probably live down there for a long periods of time, but they were actually equipped so they could stay down there for as long as a year if they were being attacked. And when the Arabs started coming in, you can see this. We were actually standing right there. This is one where Patty's actually walking through one of these. We were really a little skittish about going into it because we don't necessarily like close places. But so you see Patty coming through the down through the cave.
And
they would have a winery, they'd have a chapel, they'd have sleeping rooms, they'd have a kitchen.
And some of the passages, it would be like going from maybe here to Havelock. I mean, it was like from one city to another, and they would have these passages, and some of them were like this, and you would have to walk that way, and that's what we're seeing there. And I don't like close quarters, so I did okay.
She also doesn't like heights. But this is one thing that they had down there is they had these stones that they could roll. If they were being attacked, they would have a food supply, they'd have water, they'd have a well, they'd have a ventilation shaft for their fires and such. But these were not built by the early Christians necessarily. They came probably before that, and they've been used after that too. They actually, I've read some of them, you can imagine, will cave in after a few years, especially if nobody's there. These stone doors, though, were set so that you could shut off the enemy from getting down into your city. Some very long. This was one where they had a winery. Here they had a church, chapel, and so the underground cities are really interesting. Then another place we went to is called Hilara Valley. And this is the actual area where the Basil and Gregory and Macrina grew up. I'll go a little bit more into their family history. Their mother was Amelia. Their father was Basil the Great. Basil the Elder. Her brother was known as Basil the Great. Basil the Elder, he's also a saint in the Greek church. And this is the actual area where they grew up. And so we didn't walk the full length. I think this is 6 or 7 kilometers long, but we went about halfway. And it's got a beautiful stream running through it. But when Basil the Elder married Amelia, her mother's name was Macrina the Elder, and she's a saint in the Greek church. And Macrina the Elder, when she was wealthy, and what they did was they basically, tradition is that they established a monastery for women on one, or for a convent for women on one side of this creek, and a monastery on the other. And they gave their property, and they treated all of the people that were there as equals. This is right there along that creek. And you can see some of the caves in the side of the hills, and some of these I'm sure are chapels as well. Here's Patty and I walking down through there. It's a beautiful area, and they have actually this beautiful area where you can go out onto the water, and that's where we had lunch. So one of the big things they do in Cappadocia is they like to go up in balloons. And Patty is not a fan of heights.
But I don't know that we'll ever get back over there, and it's like, yeah, I have to go in a balloon over Cappadocia. Oh, so I'm talking here.
Yeah, but the sound's not coming through, so you can talk us through it.
Oh, I can talk you through it. So yeah, we're taking a picture. It was at sunrise. My favorite time of day is pre-dawn. My daughter says, "Mom, that's night." But I love watching the sun come up. We have an eastern deck, and I love sitting out there watching the sun come up. So this was just pretty amazing to be part of watching the sun come up over Cappadocia with all these hot air balloons. I was a little anxious as we got higher because the air got colder. And there were probably, 30 in one of those baskets,
Yeah,
would you say?
Yeah, they were huge baskets, and they had, I think we figured 32 people.
And we had to climb into the basket on a ladder. And then to get out, we had to climb down. And I'm glad I did it. I don't need to do it again, but it was just beautiful, just a beautiful, beautiful part of the country.
So again, the reason that I guess I'm so fascinated by church history is every one of us has genealogy, right? A heritage. Some people, I actually have started doing a little more ancestry.com and trying to find out where my people came from. But you know what's more important is your Christian heritage. And to me, that's what we discover when we go through church history, and we really learn where did that faith come from? How did it get transferred from our church fathers to you and me? Macarena, many people believe she should be considered the fourth church father, Cappadocian father, because she was very instrumental. But we all are on the shoulders of people named and unnamed, many of them unnamed, martyrs that are today. So let me take you through a little bit of their history. So Saint Macarena, the elder, is the grandmother of Macarena the younger. Okay, her mother was Amelia, the daughter of Macarena the elder, and her husband then was Basil. And as I understand it from what I've been able to read, is Basil was probably not that wealthy, but Macarena and Amelia's family was very wealthy. So they were aristocrats. And this is at a time, they became believers when it was a time where persecution was taking place. And I've read in one source that Macarena, the elder's husband, was martyred. But then these two are the parents of the 9 that gave birth to the Cappadocian Fathers. It's interesting, as I go back further, Macarena the elder was discipled by Gregory of Caesarea from right in this area of Turkey, and he was actually trained up by Origen. Origen is considered the first Christian genius. He wrote over 2,000 essays and different transcriptions of the Bible. He, though, was actually, when he was 14 years old, his father was being persecuted. He was going to be martyred, and he volunteered to be martyred as well. And his mother wouldn't allow him, and so he ended up becoming a very prolific author of early Christian theology and literature. But the thing that was interesting is it was St. Ambrose of Alexandria was the person that supported him financially. And so he basically, had a part in that as well. And Origen was basically from Alexandria, Egypt. So again, that's kind of wraps up. Anybody got any questions on anything we've covered? It's just amazing. Toby.
How do they do the ventilation?
Oh,
They actually have a shaft going all the way to the top that would give them air and a place for that you'd see the kitchens as you went down. Were right over that, so they could get rid of their smoke. And they had wells down there as well. So yeah, they had water, food supply, everything they needed. Yeah. Yeah.
And heard other studies. When did the Roman Catholic Church finally get its foundations throughout the world? I heard it was about 1000 AD, the Roman Catholic Church.
So say it again.
When did the Roman Catholic Church become in power?
Well, really during the Byzantine era. It would have been that during that era, because up until then they were really a persecuted minority.
Was that where the split came?
Yeah, well, the split came a little bit after that. The split between Rome, and part of it was when the Roman Empire was falling apart. They moved the capital to Constantinople, became the Byzantine Empire. But then the Byzantine Empire, there's a pattern that you see in the history books. You would have these temples, the temple to Diana at Ephesus, a good example. And then what happens is Christianity gets a foothold and it becomes a church. Or they take the stones and they move them over and they build a basilica. And then when the Muslims came in, they tore down that church. If you go to the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul today, they have curtains pulled over the images of Christ and the icons, because they're worshiping Allah. So it's historically it was a church, but now today it's a mosque. So you see this pattern, and then sometimes it goes full circle, and it comes back to becoming a church.
Yeah, I've heard various studies on that.
Yeah.
But the Roman Church pretty well took over the world during the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah. This whole era, this Byzantine era, though, was really instrumental in the development of theology and giving us what we have today as far as a faith. Yeah. Good question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Just a simpler question, but were some of those hallways low because people were shorter then, or just not in that, or not more?
I think it's just the lay of the land, if you will.
And probably they got tired of carving so much, because not only do you have to carve it out, but then you got to haul it out, right? And so, but I think, and some of those were maybe protection against invaders too, because it would slow them down. If they're short and small, you can only go one way, and so yeah. Here, question over here.
Dennis?
I saw Patty was wearing shorts in that, so I take it that's okay for women to wear shorts and not have to dress sitting right in Turkey?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
wear
go ahead.
shorts all the time. I don't think I ever put a dress on. It was so hot. I always had my shoulders covered, I do anyway. And I always take a scarf with me. Just in case I'm someplace and I need to cover my knees, I have a long scarf, I can just tie it around. But I had shorts on all the time. I think you did too, didn't you?
Yep.
All the time. Yeah. Well, I think what I want to say, if it's okay to finish,
Sure.
as I shared with you when I was here 2 times ago, this isn't original with me. I copy it really well, but I love it. Travel is the only thing you buy that makes you richer. Travel's the only thing you buy that makes you richer. So thanks for traveling with us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis and Patty. Appreciate you sharing that historical value that really helps us understand that there's a lot to our Bibles and our faith and those that have come before us. So next week, we will hear from Ginger and Enrique. They're missionaries in Mexico.